The door was made of cedar wood, carved by craftsmen who spent months on its surface. Hunting scenes, lotus flowers, the symbols of a dynasty that believed itself eternal. The hinges were gold-plated. The threshold was inlaid with marble. Everything about it announced arrival, importance, chosen status. But the door only opened one way. Not always with a lock, not always with guards. Sometimes with nothing more than an unspoken understanding. The kind that doesn't need to be stated because everyone already knows it. The kind of agreement that is never written down because writing it down would reveal it for what it was. There are women in the historical record who entered royal palaces and were never documented leaving. Not because they died young, not because the records were lost, but because once inside the machinery of a court, certain women became too useful, too knowing, or too dangerous to release back into the world. This is not a story about one empire. It is not a story about one century. It is a story about a logic, quiet, consistent, patient, that repeated itself across marble floors and silk curtains and locked garden gates for thousands of years. A logic so embedded in the structure of power that those who enforced it rarely thought of it as cruelty. They thought of it as management, as prudence, as the natural order of things. Power has never liked loose ends. And a woman who had seen too much, who had stood in the room where decisions were made, who had heard names spoken in argument, who had watched a king weep or a general beg, that woman was not a person. She was a liability, and liabilities were handled. A royal court was never simply a home. It was an apparatus, a living mechanism with moving parts, advisors, servants, priests, guards, merchants, physicians, scribes. Every person inside it served a function. Every function was tracked, and the moment a function was no longer required, the question of what to do with its carrier arose with quiet urgency. Courts operated on a principle that most institutions still use today: controlled information. What you knew, who you knew it about, and how you came to know it were not merely biographical details, they were currency. And currency, in the wrong hands, destabilized everything. The women who moved inside these systems were rarely naive about this. They understood the exchange they had entered. A daughter given in diplomatic marriage understood, at some level, that she was not simply a bride. She was a treaty made flesh. A concubine who had caught a ruler's attention understood that her value was conditional, that the warmth she experienced was real and also instrumental. A lady-in-waiting who dressed a queen for 15 years understood that the conversations she overheard were not accidental, that proximity to power was itself a form of exposure. What she did not always understand was what happened when that exposure was no longer convenient. The courts knew, the courts had always known, and the courts had systems for it. Elegant, practiced, dressed in the language of honor and protection that transformed confinement into ceremony and captivity into something that, from the outside, looked remarkably like privilege. Consider what it meant to be a woman of political value inside a royal system. Your body was not purely your own. This was not a secret, not even to you. You were born into a house, a lineage, a network of obligations that preceded your birth and would outlast your death. Your fertility was watched. Your health was monitored. Your beauty, your temperament, your education, these were investments made by others in expectation of a return that had nothing to do with your own happiness. Marriages were foreign policy, conducted at the level of the body. A princess sent across a mountain range to seal a peace agreement didn't simply gain a husband. She became the physical embodiment of that agreement, her presence at court a daily reassurance that the alliance held, her children living proof of its permanence. If the alliance broke, if war resumed, if the treaty collapsed, if political winds shifted, she didn't go home. Home no longer existed in the way it once had. Her family had moved forward. Her original court had other priorities.
She was now a relic of an agreement that no longer existed, living in a palace that no longer knew what to do with her but could not afford to release her. This was not exceptional. This was the structure. And it didn't stop with diplomatic marriages. Concubines who had borne children were attached to the court by the most permanent of biological threads. Women who had served queens for decades carried in their memory archives of information no official record would ever hold. Widows of powerful men held claims to property, to children, to political allegiances that made their future movements a matter of state concern. All of them were assets. Assets do not simply leave when they are finished being used. What exactly did they know? This question was never asked aloud. To ask it would be to acknowledge the problem directly, and direct acknowledgement was not how courts operated. But it was always present, threading through every decision about where a woman would be housed, who would have access to her, whether her correspondence would pass through additional hands before it arrived. They knew the succession disputes, the real ones, conducted behind closed doors with raised voices and barely restrained threat, while the official version was being composed for public record. They had stood in those rooms. They had seen which sons were genuinely favored and which were merely displayed for political optics. They had watched the negotiations over inheritance, the quiet purchasing of advisors, the removal of rivals under administrative pretexts. They knew about illegitimate heirs. This knowledge alone was sufficient to make a woman untouchable in multiple senses. To kill her would be to risk the secret escaping through investigation, her death generating questions, her family demanding explanation, her attendants becoming suddenly willing to speak. To release her would be to send a living archive into a world full of people who would pay dearly for what she remembered.
They knew about the affairs that carried diplomatic consequences, about the health of rulers, their weakness, their episodes of instability, their dependence on certain physicians or advisors that official histories would later scrub clean. They knew about the real reasons certain ministers had been executed, and the real reasons others had been elevated above men more qualified. They knew where the bodies were, sometimes literally, and the court could not simply ask them to forget. Memory is not a document that can be confiscated. It is not a letter that can be burned. A woman who had been in the inner chambers for 20 years carried that palace in her mind completely. Every argument, every name, every moment of betrayal, and no amount of gold or ceremony could extract it from her. The only solution was proximity, continued, controlled, permanent proximity. Keep her close, keep her dependent, keep her inside. The genius of what followed was that it didn't look like confinement. The quarters assigned were beautiful, often more beautiful than anything available to women outside the court. The fabrics were exceptional. The food was prepared by specialists. There were gardens, enclosed gardens, but still gardens, with water features and fruit trees and birds from distant regions. There were attendants. There was music performed in the evenings. There were religious observances conducted with full ceremony. Anyone looking from outside would have seen luxury. That was the architecture of it. The cruelty was not in the harshness of the conditions. The cruelty was in the precision of the boundaries, the invisible lines understood by everyone inside that did not need to be drawn on any map. You could walk to the garden. You could not walk to the gate. You could receive visitors. The visitors were approved in advance. You could write letters. The letters left only through designated hands. Guards were introduced as escorts. Attendants were introduced as companions. The language used was always the language of care. She is being protected. She is being honored. She is being preserved. Preserved is the correct word. Not kept alive in the fullest sense of aliveness. Not allowed to move freely, to choose freely, to exist without the weight of constant observation. But alive, functional, visible enough that her continued existence could be documented if anyone thought to ask, and controlled enough that what she carried would never leave the walls. This was the offer that wasn't offered, the arrangement that was never announced. It arrived through the cessation of alternatives. One morning, the possibility of leaving had simply been removed from the available options, quietly, without ceremony, without explanation, and there it was. The rest of your life, exactly here,
with all of this, without any of that. Marriage was another instrument entirely. When a woman had become a problem that needed solving, a widow who held political claims, a concubine whose son had been passed over for succession, a foreign princess whose home country had become an adversary, marriage offered a solution that looked from the outside like resolution. A strategic husband could neutralize a woman's political standing with remarkable efficiency. If she married a man of lower status, her claims diminished by proximity. If she married into a distant province, she was effectively removed from the operational center. If she married a man whose loyalties were entirely to the court, her movements became subject to someone else's oversight, someone who answered not to her, but to the power that arranged the match in the first place.
Widows presented a particular complication. A widow who had been the wife of a powerful man held a social position that her husband's death did not automatically erase. She had connections. She had access to information about her husband's networks, his agreements, his debts, his enemies. She might hold guardianship of children, which meant influence over succession that extended far beyond her own lifetime. She might command loyalty from households that had served her family for generations, allowing her to remarry freely, to choose a husband who might have his own ambitions, who might decide to use what she knew, who might become emboldened by the claims she represented, was a risk courts calculated with careful attention. The solution was not always prohibition. The solution was often control. A list of acceptable candidates, drawn up not by her but by the court. Timelines stretched without explanation, permissions delayed through bureaucratic friction, objections raised on grounds of propriety, of mourning, of the children's welfare, of the political moment. Years passed. The window of opportunity to enter a new life quietly closed, and what had once been a woman with choices became a woman accustomed to waiting for permissions that never fully arrived. She was still alive. She still received her household allocation. She still had her title and her apartments and her official standing. She just never, somehow, managed to leave. The monitoring of correspondence was so routine that it barely registered as surveillance. All letters passed through scribes. This was framed as standard procedure. Literacy was expensive, time was expensive, and the palace provided services that the outside world could not match. If you needed to write to your family, the court's scribes would assist. If you received a letter, the court's readers would process it and ensure it reached you. This was presented as a convenience. It meant that nothing written entered or left without examination. It meant that family relationships could be managed at the level of the letter itself. A sister's request to visit could simply take a very long time to be relayed through the appropriate channels. A daughter's news could arrive weeks delayed, slightly summarized. A mother's dying words could be compressed into a brief report by a court official who had read them first and decided what was essential. Information, incoming and outgoing, could be shaped. This is not a dramatic concept, it is an administrative one. The court managed correspondence the same way institutions manage internal communication now, by controlling the infrastructure through which it flows. The effect, accumulated over years, was that a woman's relationships with the outside world grew faint, not severed with any visible cut, just faint, like a voice heard from the far end of a long corridor, still present, just not quite reachable. Family visits followed the same logic. They were not prohibited, they were regulated, approved in advance, hosted in particular rooms where conversations could be overheard by attendants whose presence was explained as courtesy, limited in duration, scheduled with enough procedural friction that they became infrequent. Over time, over years, the family that had once seemed close became a series of brief appearances. People from another life who arrived, sat in a supervised room for an hour, and left again without ever quite reaching her. The reputation was the final instrument of silence.
A woman who became difficult, who asked persistent questions, who made inquiries about her legal standing, who attempted to establish correspondence outside approved channels, could find her reputation quietly managed through the social infrastructure of the court. Whispers, concerns expressed in the right conversations, Questions raised about her grief, her temperament, the effects of her circumstances on her judgment. Nothing official, nothing that could be challenged through any direct mechanism, just a slow atmospheric shift in how she was perceived, so that if she ever found a way to speak, the ground had already been prepared to discount what she said. Silence was not imposed by force. Silence was engineered through the systematic removal of every mechanism by which a person might be heard. There was a category of solution that was neither execution nor release. Courts that needed to manage a woman to solve the problem of her continued existence, her continued knowledge, her continued claims, had refined over centuries a set of measures that occupied the space between those two options with sophisticated precision. Exile to a distant estate was one approach. A property would be identified, usually several days' journey from any major center of political activity, and the arrangement would be announced with appropriate ceremony. She was being given her own establishment. She would be mistress of her own house. This was framed, consistently, as a reward. The property itself might be genuinely grand, the surrounding estate might be prosperous and well-maintained, and she would live there, surrounded by staff who reported to other authorities, visited by no one who had not been approved through channels she did not control, corresponding through mechanisms monitored from origin to destination. Alive, present, accounted for in the ledgers, gone from everything that mattered. Confinement within religious institutions carried a particular social elegance because it came wrapped in the language of piety. To enter a religious house was to withdraw from the world, not as punishment but as spiritual elevation. The court could suggest this option with tremendous gentleness. It could be made to sound like rest, like peace, like the fulfillment of a devotional calling that those who knew her had always recognized. And once inside, the institutional structure itself became the walls. No further court action required. The rules of the house did the work, and the house answered to authorities that understood, without needing to be told explicitly, what kind of resident had arrived. In other cases, there was simply nothing formal at all. No exile decree, no religious installation, just a gradual narrowing of possibility. Movement became restricted without formal declaration. Permissions became harder to obtain without formal refusal. Staff were replaced, one by people who had not spent years developing loyalty to her. Over the course of several years, without any single event that could be named and challenged, a woman found herself contained, precisely, effectively, permanently, without a single document in any royal archive acknowledging that this had been the intention.
She was alive, she remained technically free, and she was, for all practical purposes, as removed from the course of events as if she had ceased to exist. Power does not always destroy what it fears. Sometimes it preserves it, under lock and silk. The years are what broke people, not the first year. In the first year, there was still the texture of hope, the sense that this was temporary, that circumstances would shift, that someone would notice or something would change. The mind, in its first year of confinement, is still running its full operational capacity. It is looking for the door. It is calculating angles. It is managing itself for endurance, certain that endurance has a terminus somewhere ahead. The third year was different. By the third year, the mind had updated its understanding of its situation. The calculations had produced no exits. The endurance had revealed itself as not a bridge to something better, but as the condition itself, permanent, stable, not building toward anything. The luxury was still present, the fabrics, the gardens, the carefully prepared meals, but it had lost whatever power it once had to distract. What surrounded her was not a reward. It was the permanent configuration of her existence. And the self begins to change under permanent conditions. The identity of a court woman was fundamentally relational. She was wife to someone, mother to someone, daughter of somewhere, representative of something.
Her existence had been defined through her connections to other people and to the structures those connections formed. Remove those connections, not all at once, but through the slow erosion of months and years, and the identity built upon them becomes uncertain. The woman who had known with precision who she was and why it mattered begins to lose the ground beneath that certainty. This is not metaphor. This is what isolation does to the human mind across time. The sense of self, stripped of its external reference, grows fragile. Without people who remember her as she was, who carry her history in their own memory and reflect it back to her, she cannot fully sustain her own. Without a future she can plan toward, the present expands to fill everything. Endless, nearly identical days pressing forward into more of the same, with nothing to distinguish them but the season visible through the enclosed garden's walls. Dependency was engineered with particular care. Everything she needed came through the court. Housing, food, staff, clothing, medicine, security, the entire material basis of her survival was provided by the system that confined her. This was not incidental. When every resource flows through a single source, loyalty to that source becomes not a choice, but a structural reality. You do not act against the hand that sustains you, not because you have been told not to, but because acting against it would mean losing everything it provides, and you have been arranged over years to have no other source of anything. Resentment existed. It existed privately in the interior space that observation cannot penetrate, but expressing it was dangerous, and more to the point, it was functionally pointless. Through what channel would it travel? To whose ears? With what credibility after years of quiet management of her reputation?
She endured, not because endurance was a value she had chosen, but because endurance was the only available mode of existence that the institution had left her. Time, the court had learned across generations of practice, was the most reliable warden of all. It cost nothing. It required no guards to maintain. It simply moved forward, and everything it needed to accomplish, it accomplished. But not all of them simply waited. History, even the heavily curated version of history that courts preferred to leave behind, contains traces of women who found methods of resistance so precise, so patient, that they were able to exercise real influence from inside the very walls built to contain them. Correspondence, even when monitored, could carry meaning between lines that the monitors were not sophisticated enough to read. A woman who had spent years inside a court had learned its scribes, its schedules, its patterns, its gaps. She knew which attendant was quietly unhappy with her assignment. She knew which visiting official had reason to want something the court could not provide him. She understood the vulnerabilities of the system surrounding her at a level that only someone who had watched it from the inside for years could achieve. Information could move through objects, through the sequencing of gifts whose arrangement carried meaning, through the timing of requests that, read correctly by the right person outside, communicated more than they appeared to say. Courts were themselves fluent in coded communication because the need for it was constant at every level of palace politics, and the methods they had developed could be borrowed by those they sought to contain. The women's quarters, often grouped together, often sharing garden spaces and common rooms, became, in certain periods and certain courts, centers of political intelligence more nuanced than anything generated in the official chambers. Women who had access to one another, who had been living inside the system for years and had nothing to do but observe and discuss what they observed, developed analytical capabilities that the court consistently underestimated because it consistently refused to look. Because the court looked at them and saw containment. What it had actually created, through the concentration of informed, intelligent, politically aware women in close proximity over many years, was something rather different. Some of them outlasted the men who had confined them. Some watched empires restructure themselves from inside their enclosed gardens, watched suns rise and ministers fall, and entire factional configurations dissolve and reform around new priorities, and they were still there, still watching, when new power arrived to consider what to do with them. The new power often found, to its discomfort, that what it had inherited was not a passive remnant, but a woman who had spent decades doing nothing but understanding the machinery she lived inside. The archive is quiet about most of them. This is not an accident. Courts that maintained systems of controlled confinement had every incentive to leave those systems as poorly documented as possible. The official record was a curated product, assembled, edited, and in many cases deliberately shaped by scribes who worked for the institution whose reputation the record would constitute. What was useful to remember was preserved with care. What was dangerous to remember was not destroyed necessarily. Destruction leaves evidence of destruction. It was simply never created in the first place.
The experience of confined women was almost always dangerous to remember. It did not appear as absence in the record. It appeared as normalcy. The documents that survived described dowries and household budgets and inventories, the administrative surface of lives that were far more constrained than any official page would say. You can read a palace ledger from centuries ago that tracks the expenses of a former queen's household across 30 years. Fabrics purchased, meals provided, staff compensated, candles ordered for religious observance, and if you do not know to look for what is not there, you might read it as evidence of a comfortable, perhaps even content life. What is not there? Evidence of departure, evidence of correspondence with family beyond the early years, evidence of any request granted for movement beyond the established boundaries, evidence of her in any record generated by any source that was not controlled by the institution managing her. She exists in the documents as a function of the costs associated with her maintenance, a line item in a ledger, managed, accounted for, present, not a person, not a life, an expense category that persisted for decades until it simply stopped appearing, and no one recorded why. Later generations who encountered these silences filled them with assumption. The assumption of contentment because the material conditions were adequate and no complaint appears in any document. The assumption of choice because there is no formal record of protest or petition. The assumption of normalcy because normal is what we reach for when we cannot see the walls from where we stand. But the walls were there. They had always been there. And the absence of documentation was not evidence that the walls were absent. It was evidence that the walls had been built by people who understood with complete clarity that documentation was itself a form of exposure. What the cedar door opened into was not, in the end, a palace. It was a closed system dressed in the language of honor, the same language that power has always used when it needs to do something it cannot name directly. Protection, care, privilege, preservation. The words change across time and geography. The logic underneath them does not. A woman who knew too much, a woman whose claims made her continued freedom inconvenient, a woman whose connections to the outside world represented a vulnerability that the institution preferred to manage from within rather than eliminate through means that would generate questions. That woman was not offered a choice that deserved the name choice. She was offered marble and silk and gardens and attendants and the beautiful, suffocating permanence of a life that was hers in every way except the one that mattered. She could not leave, not because of a single lock on a single door, because the entire apparatus surrounding her, the staff, the correspondence, the resources, the reputation, the slow erosion of external ties, the engineering of complete material dependence, had been oriented with tremendous care and without a single official document acknowledging the fact toward making departure something that did not happen. This is what power looks like when it is operating at its most sophisticated. Not violent, not dramatic, patient, architectural, and absolutely certain of itself. History is full of these women. They appear briefly in official records as wives, as concubines, as widows, as ladies of the court, and then they continue to appear in household accounts for decades, for the full remainder of their natural lives, without a single record of the departure that never came. Their names are in ledgers, their expenses are documented. Their existence was managed with the precision of a court that understood exactly what it was doing. Their interior life was never recorded at all. And yet, in some of those enclosed gardens, in some of those silenced rooms, in some of those decades of careful observation conducted from behind walls that no map ever officially marked, there was something that the institution could not reach. The self, the private interior, the understanding that what surrounded her was not, as presented, an honor. She knew what she knew. She had always known. And even if no one outside would ever hear it, even if the archive would remain silent on the matter for centuries, even if the only person in the world who fully understood the nature of her captivity was herself, she knew. That knowing was not nothing. It was, in fact, the one thing that remained entirely hers. Power can confine the body. It can restrict movement and monitor correspondence and control every material resource and engineer dependency so complete that survival itself becomes a form of cooperation with the system. It can manage reputation and slow the erosion of every external connection. It can turn luxury into a cage so refined that most people viewing it from outside will never see it as a cage at all. What it cannot do, what it has never managed across all its centuries and all its marble floors and silk curtains and golden hinges, is reach inside. She lived inside the walls they built. She also lived somewhere those walls could never go. And in the end, across all the ledgers, all the curated silences, all the carefully maintained absences in the official record, it is that interior life, unreachable and therefore unconquerable, that history cannot fully erase, because you are reading about her now. The archive tried. She remained.